The very opening day of the studio, which I would say was the meeting where we said, what are we going to do? Because we were bored with the current situation. We didn't have an office or anything, we didn't have a space to work in, but there was a meeting. And the thing that everybody said was, I want a conversation. And I want that to be an ongoing, productive conversation. And so that was the thing that drove us to actually take it to the next step, because I think everybody felt like that was what was missing. The ability to sort of use your voice in a way that might be provocative, would be supported. I mean, it all comes from there. Everything that we do comes from that basis. Yeah. And so this idea of kind of protecting a non-hierarchical environment that allowed that to happen was really important. I think you do get it in education, actually. I think the AA school is a really good example of that. And that's one of the things I thoroughly enjoyed about it, particularly amongst the tutors. The open-hearted, open-minded sort of response that was there was truly something. I mean, I'll cherish that forever. In the commercial world, it happens much less so. As soon as I guess a lot of those tutors leave and they go into their practice, they have to be a certain way. And there's a good reason for it. It's to do with delivering, it's to do with productivity, it's to do with profit. The first thing I did, I was midway through doing it as I graduated, was made a film that led into 4 other films. And before I knew it, the thing that I was really interested in was filmmaking. And although I hadn't studied that, I'd studied some visual communication and graphic design. But filmmaking was the kind of thing that really sort of excited me on many of the levels that I've been studying, to do with communication, but also things that I was more interested in to do with narrative and storytelling and projecting ideas in interesting ways. So film kind of ticked all those boxes. And I did that for a couple of years, and some painting. I was doing a lot of painting for the record industry, like for bands like Soul to Soul and In Excess. I did work for those kinds of people. And then as that was going on, I kind of met more around me, and we set up something called Tomato Studio back in 1991. And I've been doing that ever since. And effectively that studio was a collaborative effort, a collective, 6-7 core members that grew, expanded up to, I don't know, 35, 40 people at one point, and then contracted again. And as culture has changed, business culture and the way that we work together has sort of dispersed to some extent. This is a good example, using the internet here. I mean, now it's more of a network, to be honest, than a functioning physical studio. It's a kind of group of people that talk now and again. The work that has happened over that period has been, I mean, I'm so lucky to an extent in the breadth of what we were able to do, which sort of went from very free thinking, books that were our own poems and exhibitions based on our output that was non-commercial, all the way through to directing very, very hard-edged TV commercials for things like I mean, things that you do to embrace the craft, but also pay the bills. So yes,
it's interesting because there's something interesting about, obviously you established your practice long before, well, I guess early days of internet, in fact.
It was really before that, yeah.
Before that. And it's a completely different set of rules.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then I think that kind of then justifies your use of internet, as your use of Instagram, as just something that, well, is a kind of communication tool that emerged. It's not a means to be creative, which I think in my case might be almost,
Yeah, it's interesting, that point, because I suppose I am of the generation that straddled those two periods between purely analog and it's not purely digital, but the emphasis is way stronger on the digital than it is on the analog these days. And what we were about was looking at these processes. I don't think we could have done what we did, which was built around the idea of process itself, or the idea of process as a means to finding executions or outputs. I don't think we could have sort of done that successfully at this point in time. It wouldn't have made as much sense. But what was amazing about it was because the digital was becoming stronger and stronger and stronger, month on month on month, the idea of the relationship between those organic analog things and this new way of doing things was constantly a battle, and it was brilliant because it sort of fed into the energy of what we were talking about. What is a process? How does it work? When are you being authentic or not?
Yeah.
You know? And
at what point do you stop relying to something that you thought was your methodology?
Yeah,
because the environment has changed.
I don't think I've let go of that, and I don't know whether that's through sort of me being comfortable with it or arrogant about it, or whether I hope that what we're talking, or what I've been talking about, is the right way to do things. It comes down to very simple ways of looking at what you're making. I don't adhere to the idea that you produce a final result. I've never been that interested in that. I think you produce many results, and you continue to produce them as long as you produce, and they maybe add up to something at the end, if there is an end to that, I guess, when you stop. I think that the points along the way are really fascinating. I think some are stronger than others. You can look back and point at certain things and say, yeah, that feels complete, but it will only ever be part of the next thing anyway. So I'm quite comfortable with this new sense of the ephemeral.
Ambiguity, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's always been part of what we were talking about. The idea of working through a process to get to something. A process should have a beginning and an end, unless you decide that the process continues, and that the point is the process itself. That's where we were. That's what it was all about. It was about that conversation, effectively.
Yeah.
I think where you have to kind of tread the line carefully is when you're alluding to something you mentioned earlier about the commerciality of things. I mean, that's another whole area of conversation about when something becomes infected by that, if you like, or affected, affected by this sort of commercial constraint. And actually the idea of finishing something off ties straight into that, because you have to deliver it, and it has to be something that works. That's effectively what design needs to do. It solves a problem. It's no good saying to the client or the patron, whoever it is, might be okay for a little while, not sure. They want to know the answer. So
what kind of films did you do?
Well, the very first film was, I knew a whole bunch of people that were graffiti artists before it was even called street art, really. And they had a crew, if you like, called the Bash Street Kids. They used to run a thing called the Circle Line parties on the Circle Line. And effectively, there were 100 to 150 of them, sort of swelled up to that number, who went to have a party on the Circle Line and paint the trains. And it was a game of cat and mouse between them and the authorities, the transport police. They had their own security system. They, and guards that they had for that role to make sure nothing got out of hand. They had a system. They knew where all the police stations were. It was really interesting. So I kind of came across this and was fascinated by it and asked them, look, can I film it? And they let me do that, as long as I never showed it to anyone in the UK or Europe, because, there they were doing their business. But I cut the film together. We shot it on Super 8, and actually the initial film, we spliced a lot of it together on a on a cutting bed with razor blades and sellotape. I mean, it was done like that. There was no non-linear editing. And I think the Camden Film Co-op helped us a little bit. We got this thing into some form, and I managed to sell it to a Japanese TV company as a title sequence piece, who then said, do you want to make some more? And so we did something on the busking scene in London. We did something on the couriers, the bike couriers.
Simon, it looks like you do have a real sense of commercial thinking within your practice.
Yes and no, but I think it goes as far as we're talking now, and you might
yes.
and say something that could lead to something. People often say, how do you get your work? And I honestly don't know. I mean, I really can't answer that question. I think you have to sort of make things, put them out there, and see what happens, and then do everything possible to make sure something happens. You create your own luck to a certain extent.
Because it's quite exciting, something that was purely driven by your intention to explore a scene through film, to selling it to a Japanese TV company.
Yeah, I mean, really, I mean, you couldn't make it up, and I felt so lucky. And that TV company in Japan became my Japanese production company. So I ended up making, for a few years, I made a load of really, really bad Japanese rock videos. That's how I learned, because we hadn't had any proper training. So everything so far up to this point had been through sort of luck, really, and kind of common sense. And then what happened was it got more serious, and I kind of made a lot of mistakes abroad. So, that was okay. And then effectively sort of got a film reel, a show reel together. And that happened around the time that I started with the guys to make Tomato. And then it became a bit more sort of viable as an option. Yeah, okay. How about if you make some TV shows, some TV commercials, or how about if you make some documentary work? And actually, it's sort of my whole career, that's been a mainstay, that kind of using time-based media to talk about what I want to talk about.
There's also something about ways in which your work is perceived, or even like a form of practice. Because I mean, you taught at the AA, Architectural Association, and I'm an architect. So in the architectural education, you always have this notion of an architectural practice, which is the most oppressive environment one can imagine, yet it's taught as a kind of ideal of practice. And I mean, I would always encourage anyone to always challenge that. So, I mean, what's interesting in what you're saying is that you're somehow constantly evolving a form of practice and kind of relationships with clients, relationships with the creativity and processes.
You go back again to the idea of process and this idea of a continuum. Nothing is ever fixed. I mean, the best architectural practice in the world knows that and works around that. I think what's really interesting is when you start to get into the realm of hierarchy in the different contexts. And interestingly, the film production process is built on a very, very defined hierarchical structure, as is the architectural process, architectural practice, I should say. So I kind of find that fascinating about how you use it, how to maintain sort of solidarity within a practice and the ability to function properly, I suppose, concretely, productively, and also free everybody up enough to not be stuck within a hierarchical position, which is quite difficult. I mean, what happened with us, we weren't an architectural practice, and we weren't strictly just a film studio. We were exploring different areas of creative output. So the group was made up of musicians and still is. Two of them are very much involved. It was made up of a painter, a writer, filmmakers, as I said, and what you would class as kind of commercial artists, I suppose, graphic designers, which has altered slightly in the more recent time, but back in that point, it was a craft actually. And so how do you sort of do something that's not, hold those people together without a hierarchical structure, even to the extent of not having a boss of the studio? No, there was no leader particularly. And what came into sort of action quite quickly was how the ego works, particularly with creative people. How do you sort of try and balance that? Because, you know, your idea is important. Your idea might be the best as far as you're concerned. And you have to somehow manage that, wrestle that with somebody else's idea that's important. This idea of kind of collaboration and experimenting with different collaborative frameworks, bringing together people from the same background, different backgrounds. It was fantastic. I mean, every day was an experiment.
How did you find the environment where architecture is discussed while you taught at the Architectural Association?
That was a really daunting prospect for me, because I went there open-eyed. I mean, I knew what I was sort of getting into. I'd been on some tables at the bar there before. I knew what a crit was in those terms. I think what's really interesting about architecture is how diverse the focal point can be. You know, it's probably always political. It's definitely social. For sure, it's creative, and it deals with aesthetics. It can be highly technical, but it doesn't have to be. Already right there. If you put four people together that are talking on those levels from their point of view, you've got an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
So the way I sort of entered it was, I'm really interested in what something means, what, like, the reason for doing it, and what the effect of that thing that you've done might be. And I sort of always went into the sort of crit scenario with that in mind, not whether it was. Well, I guess there's a judgment to be made, but not whether it was good or not aesthetically necessarily, or any other. What was the effect of it likely to be? And what was its intention? And then I would pick that apart. And if it was true, or I could help make it truer in some way, then I felt I'd done my job. My job wasn't to sort of try and cover what some of the other tutors were more versed in. I mean, you've got to understand, for me as well, I was benefiting enormously from this, because I was learning about something I'd always been fascinated.
Yes.
So, and hopefully giving over some things that other people were.
Well, I'm sure, yes.
You know, so
I mean, that is a kind of, I think that's probably another question is, I guess, how much has it at all impacted your own practice in terms of things you might have learned? Or
I think it's made me much more aware of a sort of critical response. I'm much harder on myself, I guess. I'm not, you know, I might sort of just enjoy something for the sake of it. And I don't want to lose that, by the way. I think it's really important to enjoy things for the sake of them. The last year I did was based on the idea of play and what play might be, you know. It's highly non-critical sort of area. But yeah, it also tuned me up to, I've done quite a lot of spatial stuff anyway. I've done a lot of kind of public space and work and exhibition work and theatre work and what have you. So I was very much aware of three-dimensional spaces and atmospheres that go with that. But it definitely made me look more specifically at space in a new way. I saw it through different eyes, and that was a benefit.
Is film present in your work today?
Yeah, I mean, it's been difficult, I have to be honest, this last year because of the ability to go out and do it. But I've been working with the band Underworld, who have been producing a lot of music that needed film content. I actually made 35 films, I think, over in a period of a year for them. And I was doing sort of one a week. It was really crazy. And what was interesting about that was, it was almost like going back to the very early days that I described at the beginning of talking to you, in that we had no time, no equipment, and literally the tools at hand. and it was so liberating. There was one particular day I got a lot of students from the school, from the AA school, to come and wear masks and perform. And
they came with masks.
Yeah, what happened was we had a track.
So at a moment of fortune telling.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they were full face masks. We made them out of cardboard. They were sort of fetishist objects in a way, and sort of, you know, in a way we built a sort of tribe around them, and a gathering. And without knowing what anybody really did, I invited, I think there were 8 or 9 people, to come down, choose a mask, and then perform wearing it, and help each other whilst doing that. One of the tricks was that the mask wouldn't stay on your face. Someone else had to hold it, which was fantastic because it brought other people into the event.
It creates a choreography about an object.
Yeah, we spent an afternoon in this space doing that and cut this film together. And it was, the whole thing was done and edited in, you know, 2 days. And what's fantastic about that approach is you're sketching. You're not trying to achieve a result particularly. You're just literally playing and then sculpting something together to music. And that's one example, but I spent the best part of a year doing that every week for the band. And then we released that it's online and as a DVD. Some were successful, others not so much, but you know, I feel the digital revolution has liberated how we make film. There's no worrying about loading 16mm into a canister and only having, you know, 4 or 11 minutes to shoot what you want, and exposure times and lighting. It's all become really kind of fluid. And I love that about it.
There's a real sense of freedom in your work, in the trajectory.
Yeah.
Looks like you haven't really been afraid of just doing something completely different.
No, look, my approach has always been, right from the beginning, right from art school, is that you make something, you show it to somebody, and hopefully they commission you, or they buy the thing you've just shown them. I think that's the same.
That is fantastic.
In
it's such a good lesson.
Yeah, I mean, we have to make. I mean, you know, bring commerciality into it by all means, but that's secondary. Business will always follow good work. You know, that's been the case and will always be the case. I know you can design a business. You can have a business plan. You can set out with a very clear aim, and you can make it happen. I know that, but I make things. I think things, and I try to show them or explain them, and I use visual or audio medium to do that. That's what I do. Then I have to make some money. That's what I do after I've made the things. Yeah.
I think that's a really, well, it's an unusual notion. It's not it's not a rule book
I just assume
approach.
everybody did that, to be honest with you. I don't, you know, I really do assume everybody does that. I mean, when I see the greats out there, you know, the people that I respect and look up to in every field, be it architecture or theatre or fine art, whatever it is, I just assume that those people are driven by a desire to get their message out, get their idea out there.
I mean, I believe in that. I think I strongly agree with you. I couldn't agree more. I just feel that, I mean, personally, I haven't sold much of my work, but, you know, I don't particularly think it's particularly great, but I feel that, you know, if I'm comfortable with it, at some point, probably will materialize into something.
Absolutely, I think that's evident. I mean, you know, the progression, quantity and progression of what you're doing with that particular strand that I've been seeing. It's very clear to me that that work has everything about it that looks collectible to me by a collector. And the reason is that it's not going away, that it's not afraid of what it is. It's pure. It knows what it is. And within knowing what it is, it wants to explore other areas.
Oh, thank you, Simon.
Well, no, I mean it. I mean it. Sure. I mean, that's what attracted me to the stream. And I thought, wow, this is confident. This is sure of itself. And
yes, yeah, I think there is certain confidence in it. I often think, I guess I often wonder whether I'm completely delusional, but yet I just think if I start to doubt it, it will just stop me from doing things. And
for sure. And you know, and then the next part is, well, how do I make money out of it? Now, I suppose where the divergence is in terms of what my studio has done generally, and the thing that we're talking about with what you're producing, is that the diversity of the studio is, of course, more. Mainly because there were so many people, but everybody worked around a very similar philosophy. So what was driving this diversity was the same thing.
Yeah,
that's where the things converge again. And I think that that is what a practice should have, regardless of whether it's specific or not. It has,
or perhaps regardless how big the practice is in terms of
regardless of how diverse the output is, how many different types of mediums it takes on, or how focused the output is. It must have a sense of understanding what it's about and what it's doing, because I think that's fundamental to a sustainable model, if you like. Not a sustainable business model, but a sustainable creative model. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't change your mind. That's part of your philosophy. You have to build the philosophy that allows you to change your mind. You know.
And how do you feel about those philosophy? I mean, I'm understanding you in a way that even when you say that there is a philosophy, that sometimes that philosophy, you know, perhaps is not even verbalized, or is not, you know, there isn't a kind of manifesto type.
Yeah, I understand.
You know, there isn't an object but it could somehow be embodied.
Yeah.
You know, it could be the spirit of the work can.
Yes, the spirit
feel a certain consistency.
There's nothing more laborious than rigidly sticking to a manifesto. You know, I mean, in film, there were the famous group, the Dogma group, and they had a very strict manifesto about how they would go about making their film.
Dogma,
Yeah. And it was a great joke, because actually, as soon as they put the camera up, they ignored it, which was fantastic. And it produced some really interesting results. And I think that the point there was that they wrote the manifesto and then ignored it. I think that's fantastic, because that's the spirit. That's the thing we want.
Have you ever written a manifesto? Because I have.
Yeah, I've made several attempts at it, and I think immediately I write them, I sort of think, well, that's wrong. I'll write another one, and in a way, that's what's beautiful about them, isn't it? That, you know, they're very naive.
I guess as soon as it's written, it becomes history in a way. Yeah.
Because something else will happen, right? And I think the best manifestos tend to be, you know, sort of one word, and that's what I will do. There's an interesting thing, isn't there, between, you know, sort of thought and action, and where those two things kind of meet, and what you do at one point, and are you doing both at the same time, or are you just doing one or the other? And I'm really interested in that way of working, actually.
Yeah.
You know, because
what would be?
It's about
what would be your?
Isn't it?
Yeah. I'm wondering what would be. What do you think? What would be your one-word manifesto right now?
I would have to go back to the one I've always used, and that's process.
All right.
And then we'll explore what that means. You know, but process means I'm in action all the time. Yeah. So if I sort of ever get stuck, I try to remember that, do something, and as soon as something occurs, and
it's like a pill. Yeah, it's like something that is so pain relieving, that is amazing.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I find with it though is, you know, I've always suffered a bit from this, is prevaricating about starting. And I think the reason is I subconsciously know how difficult that might be. So I put off doing it, and then I get miserable because I'm not doing it. And you know, you have to have all sorts of little techniques. Like one of mine is to sort of just write a sentence. And then I've started. Okay. Oh, that was good. That was fun. What was that thing I was going to do? A much bigger thing. Yeah, I'll do that now. And little things that just get you going, you know, because sometimes it is a bit daunting. You know, for me anyway. Maybe it isn't for everybody, but sometimes it's a bit.
I wrote 3 words in my notes on the top of the page for this conversation, and that's something that I've kind of 3 words that to me somehow capture your work. And you can tell me whether any of when I asked you what would be your 1-word manifesto, I was wondering whether you'd mention one of these 3 words. But I have these 3 words written here: message, image, and speed.
Oh, interesting. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, message comes into it, and I think it's good that we've talked about that in the conversation, because what something is intended for, what its purpose is important to me. And it doesn't matter if the purpose is that it doesn't have one. That's fine. But we must talk about that somehow. So that message is important. Image. I've thought about this quite a bit, and I kind of, it's stretching it a bit, but I'd sort of rather talk about the idea of image in a way. I'm very wedded to it, but it includes any sensory aspect, not just the visual.
It's not static.
No, perhaps. And it's also it could be olfactory, it could be audio, it could be tactile. I think image, yes, it can be all of those things. So yeah, I think sort of sensorial impact is really important, and speed. I love that as a note, because it doesn't mean fast. It just talks about temporality, and
But it's not quite duration, because I feel duration has a kind of limit. Yeah.
No, speed is excellent, because what it does is it immediately brings in time, which is something that I'm fascinated by. I mean, I think that definitely came early on from the film side of things, but music too, and getting more involved in sort of working with media through editing processes. Time is such a fantastic sort of thing to work with, very intangible, sometimes very direct. I've been reading about heat recently, and how it's impossible to describe or approach or understand heat without the aspect of time involved, because heat literally requires the travel from one temperature to another, and there is a time aspect to that, and it ties into sort of quantum mechanics in this area. And I sort of think, wow, that's again going back to speed. I suppose that's where it comes from. But that idea of temporality is fantastic to bring into,
or kind of energy generating process.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, all of those things. I mean, there are then secondary terms that come out of that, and things that occur to me when we start talking about speed, energy, and time, and things like nostalgia, and which is a dangerous place to go, particularly in a creative sense. But they play a part, particularly when you're sort of making ephemeral things that are intended to disappear. And the idea is that you're leaving things like memory, and how memory plays into that. I'm really fascinated by those things, and what, is there a place for that in this work? How can we embed memory into something? Those sorts of ideas. And there are very simple ways of doing it, which is literally to kind of add texture, and some sort of sense of time having passed. But there are much more sophisticated ways of doing it, that sort of, you attempt to make something that is going to age in a certain way, but it hasn't yet. So there are experiments in that respect. You've got me started on on these very abstract ways of thinking about what we make, but I do genuinely think about those things as methods to get to a point. I mean, the other thing I think that sort of plays into all of this is this kind of call and response aspect to what we do. So, there's obviously a recipient of this stuff. There's an audience to it, and at some point they should be considered, but by considering them, do you affect what you're doing? You know, there's that kind of tension between the two things, like wanting to be looked at, wanting to be observed, but wanting to be authentic and pure. And I think this sort of idea, this notion of speed and actually something being fast is really interesting. That's what occurred to me when you were talking about speed, because trying to dodge that bullet is to keep making as fast and fast as possible, and to be agile and active and dynamic, and not look behind you. And
yeah,
you know, I know that's something that I sort of crave to do, because I find it a sort of enormous escapism to do that. Nothing matters because I'm on to the next thing anyway. And you know, rather than sort of gazing at it for too long and over worrying about it and over sort of articulating it. But having said that, where would we be if people weren't consuming what we make, if they weren't looking at it, if they weren't being absorbed by it? It would be awful. You know, you have to have a recipient for this stuff.
A channel, yeah.
Otherwise,
well, I guess maybe that, I guess that takes us back to the first word, which is message.
Yeah.
The kind of strong feeling that there is a recipient for your work that is attempting and wanting to communicate.
Michael Haneke, the filmmaker, said, you know, I have no message. I only have questions. There is no message in my work. And I think he was, I think he was paraphrasing. I think it was Chekhov that said, the writer only asks questions, he doesn't provide answers. I've always felt that was the difference between, or a difference, not the difference, between design and art, I suppose you could art.
Yeah.
In that, you know, design, the purpose of design is to answer a question. That's what it's there for. It's a sort of problem-solving endeavor. And really, I think the purpose of contemporary art, at least since the period of modernism started, has been to ask questions, to critique. So I sort of, you know, going back to message, I think for me the message is that really, is to say, look at yourself, or look at the world, or my message is, have you considered this? Yeah.
It's actually a dialogue.
Precisely. Yeah. Yeah, rather than the truth. Yeah, I think the idea of truth is very subjective. So, what things mean, there'll be lots of individual parts to that. But overall, I think asking questions of each other is how we resolve things.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned Haneke, because he has a very peculiar relationship to an audience, right? He almost punishes the audience.
Yeah, he's quite aloof, I think.
Yeah. I guess when I watched Funny Games, I think that was the first time when I really felt punished by what I was watching. Yeah.
The thing is, with his films, what I find interesting is how demanding he is of you to engage in what he's presenting you with. There aren't any light moments of entertainment that let you off the hook. He's kind of constantly asking you to really analyze this and look at it in the way that he's looking at it. That's the impression I get. And I mean, I'm not a great scholar of his work, but I've seen quite a bit of it. And whenever I sit down to watch one of the films or rewatch one of the films, I have to sort of brace myself for that a little bit and say, you know, I'm going to take this as seriously as he demands me to take it, because that's the process of watching one of these films. It's going to an event rather than just, you know, being entertained, which is also great. I mean, I love being entertained.
Well, though it's a kind of, okay, I mean, I said it sometimes feels like a punishment. In a sense, it's such an engaging experience because it does engage you rather than say, you can be completely unengaged and passive.
It's quite sort of, if you made the analogy with a physical pursuit, you'd be pushing yourself.
Mm.
And the result of that is that it can be quite, mentally exhausting or, punishing. I sort of agree. I think that's exactly what it is. Even when some of them are quite boring in places, and he's using that, and he's asking you to sort of consider what that is, what that means, which I love. I love the idea of using boredom as a kind of tool to sort of say something. I think that's where you find really interesting things happening, because it becomes automatic. And your mind wanders, and suddenly you realize you've done something different, and it's exciting again. And I think that's a really good tool, actually.
What's interesting, I guess, beyond the real subject of his films, is that whether he's allowed to produce such films because he's now already has a kind of critical audience that would watch it, that will immediately justify the investment by production companies into the film, or he just doesn't care.
That's an interesting question about how, his public face suggests that he doesn't care, and he's very brave and, brazen, and he's an auteur. But, this goes back to your earlier question about commerce. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to be dealt with, and there are people investing, and they expect a result. And he's very successful, and it's not an accident.
Yeah,
and it isn't just because he's single-minded, although that helps. But his audience expects something of him, and he delivers it. Yeah. His investor expects him to deliver what his audience wants. Then they know that they will get X amount of ticket sales.
That's the notion of being, or maybe successful, I guess, if success means anything anyway. But
being recognized in terms of success being a recognition. I think that's right. He's defined his product, if we want to be really analytical. And he knows what his product is, and he knows the boundaries of that product, and which buttons to press to kind of make sure that you're getting the product he's promised you. If he went and did a sort of a Ghibli animation, well, maybe he should. That would be fantastic, wouldn't it? Haneke does Ghibli. What would that be like?
I did watch. Maybe I'll throw this in and see if you respond to it. But I saw last night. I watched Len, the French film, black and white. Hate.
Yeah. Oh, I haven't. Do you know? It's interesting you mention that, because it's been. It must be an anniversary or something. It's been in the public realm recently a lot, and I've been revisiting quite a lot of films from that era, and before, 70s films as well. It's great. It's
such a masterpiece.
Yeah, it's so relevant now.
Yeah, and it's such a portrait of a city.
Yeah.
Of Paris.
Yeah,
I found that very gripping. That it feels like it's about Paris.
And when I say relevant now, I don't just mean that its subject matter is in the news and BLM and this area. I'm talking about the way it's shot, and the intimacy and the immediacy of it is really now. Stunning how sort of much foresight was, or was it luck? I don't know. But you could literally release that film as a new film today, and it would be sort of a masterpiece again.
It would be, yeah.
No,
incredibly contemporary. But I also, sorry, I'm now bombarding you with things I've seen recently. But on that point that something could be just released now and it looks incredibly contemporary is the Conversation from 1970 or something.
Yeah, I was talking last night. It's very detailed, that film. The editing in it, I think Walter Murch did the editing, if my memory serves me. who really is a fantastic editor. He really understands how to elicit a response just by doing certain techniques within. He wrote a great book called In the Blink of an Eye, and it's about the cutting points that you use to make something more powerful or less powerful and make your point. And I think in that film, what's interesting about, because it's all about sound, effectively.
Because there is a whole sound element, yeah.
Yeah, and how the editing works with that is fascinating, and how the sound Foley track works is really, really clever. It's sort of a masterclass in that area, I think. I was just trying to think of anything that was sort of tied in with those that was really relevant from that period. And the more recent one that I watched that's worth a mention is Taxi Driver.
I watched Taxi Driver a few weeks ago.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I love about that is how it refers back to Dostoevsky and how he used, I think it was notes from the underground to write that story.
Pure existentialism. It is called an existentialist film.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating when you see in the shots. I think every single shot has him in it, more or less. I mean, there's the ones in the office where in the governor's office where he's not, and I think Scorsese talked a bit about that. But De Niro's in practically every single shot.
I didn't notice that.
Definitely in every scene, and it's when you rewatch it from that point, it's fascinating how intense that gets, almost like a painting, actually.
So, why do you think? What's the relevance?
I think for me, what's sort of interesting about that is how it draws. That Lahane doesn't, but how it's the story of a city, but it's drawing backwards into Dostoevsky and earlier ideas about existentialism, but it's also using this, what was then, really up-to-date contemporary moment of the Vietnam War and what was happening in America and how it was adapting and altering. And then when we look at it now, it still somehow really chimes. When I watched it the other day, I sort of felt like it was a warning for now. It was kind of, a sort of siren, if you like. I felt that the points they were making were the alienation point, the atomization that we're going through due to technology, effectively, and the way that technology is impacting culture is causing this sort of a sense of disenfranchisement and atomization. I think is all in that film.
I think there's also that notion of contradiction, contradictory figure, which is something that I can very closely relate to.
It's fantastic. The anti-hero being the main point of focus, and the pivot points, and this idea of right and wrong, and kind of how to.
And in fact, she calls him a walking contradiction at some point.
I mean, it's very edgy on that level. So many, you could pick apart so many aspects of it from, every area of sort of contemporary culture that we're interested in, to do with sort of gender politics and to do with notions of identity in the wider sphere. They're all kind of embedded in there.
Well, I don't know. We could talk a little bit about identity, because I guess that's something that I mean, I don't particularly struggle with, but I find it sometimes too prescribed as a way of approaching an art practice. You're almost expected to declare yourself, and then your work somehow really has to show that. And that is actually part of my thinking behind the pseudonym that I use. Is that I found that, I mean, I could say I'm an Eastern European, I grew up in a war zone, my grandfather stepped on a mine, and, I could really dramatize my life. for the purpose of Western audience being entertained by my identity, and then that becomes the subject of my work. And then maybe I would actually be quite a successful artist selling lots of work.
Well, it's a tactic.
You know, but then really, is that supposed to become a tactic? Tomato doesn't really have a strong sense of identity in that sense.
It depends who you speak to. I mean, and what their relationship to it is as an audience rather than as a participant. It's as an identity, it was built up of many different people. I suppose the identity of it really was that it was this multidisciplinary, sort of randomly functioning group that were looking for something. Mm-hmm. I suppose that's, in its heyday, that's kind of what it was. And here's what it looks like at the moment. And then we did several books that were that moment, and they look slightly different in each case. And that's that, because you know, it's very difficult to build a structured identity when you've got so many different people feeding into it. So in a way, it's more honest and more natural from that respect.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a thing that I think about with a lot with identity. I think there's something I wrote many years ago, which is language is the code of your identity. Right? So language isn't just how you say and what you say and how you speak. Language is everything at hand that can present you as an individual. So, you know, it's all of the things we talked about before, all the sensorial aspects. But mainly, you know, those are going to come from visual things, or from performance, behavior, or spoken word or written word. So to some extent, that's the tool that you have. The language that you use is the tool that you have to kind of create the specific identity you want. The interpretation of that is going to be the result. You can't do much about it.
Yeah.
Someone calls you an artist, then that's great, because that's what they think you are. And if enough people say it, that is what you are. If they call you something else, then that's what you are.
Yeah.
You can rail against it as much as you like, but the truth of the matter is that that's what it is. And you earn those things. If you can make it strong enough that you get the one you want, then you've done the job well for what you wanted. If you're not worried about it, it comes out that way. So
how do you practice right now? If you say tomato is slightly a thing of the past? Or?
Yeah. I would say that its heyday was definitely in the past. What I think is that my identity has become less about tomato and more about me as an individual. But I am from the group. I still use the name because I will probably always have it, and I will constantly be transitioning to and from it. The way I sort of try to set my identity out at the moment is just through what I produce. So yeah, I'm hoping, I don't know if it's true or not, I'm hoping that it's interesting enough for people to lift the lid up and delve deeper. And I can't ask for any more than that. It was very welcome and flattering that you asked me to do this with you, this talk with you, regardless of where it goes. Just the fact that you were interested and wanted to have this conversation effectively reinforces the identity that I hope I am building. You know, that's sort of how I see it effectively. And unfortunately, I do get enough of those requests to do these things. So I kind of feel like perhaps I am on the right path here. I have no idea what it leads to, but it's an identity that I'm happy to have, that I'm somebody that people want to perhaps speak to and have a conversation with.
Something I found, a short clip, I think must have been on YouTube or something, where you said that the studio exists and does its work, and then that the clients come into the environment of the studio. Rather than, and actually that the client responds to the studio rather than studio responding to the client, which I just think it's a beautiful way of approaching things. I mean, it's a dance, that one. And, you know,
the thing I hold true is that the client who is entering the studio as an act of exploration to join is the client that will always get the best result. So I, of course, I'm practical. If a client comes in here and they think they know what they want and they're not going to listen, and I think I can manage that job, for X many hours, for Y much money, okay. But I also know what the result will be. It will be exactly what they asked me to do, and then all we've done is sort of made some money. I think that should be true for everything, really. I mean, you can go shopping. It's kind of nice if you don't know what you're going to buy and you come home with a surprise. See it as shopping, Yeah. You can go for a walk and not take a map.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I honestly believe that the best clients are the ones that become part of the collaborative team. We've got their back. We know what they want and what they need. We're the soldiers that will help them get that. They can be the general if they need to be that at certain points. It's okay. Of course, I want to give people.
But do you feel you need a client?
I think it's. You know what? That's really interesting, because the immediacy of it creates a tension, a good tension. The lack of it creates another type of tension, which is a more negative type. And the first thing that you do is you sort of discuss some parameters with yourself. So you've got a client, it's you, effectively, and you've just laid out the parameters. And if you stick to them, you get through it. And if you don't stick to the parameters that you set yourself, you don't get anywhere, because there's no heat in the equation. So, yes, I suppose the answer is yes, you do, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the one you imagine. It can be yourself. Just you have to be quite realistic about that, because, a piece of white paper is a very scary thing, or a camera that hasn't had that's got a roll of film in it is a scary thing, because, it's got to be good. That's what we're here for, in your mind.
We seem to be engaged in a process of setting parameters.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's what we should do. And, I really think that here's the contradiction. We want to be free to think. But we can't do it unless we have those parameters. And the parameter, the edge of things, is where it all happens, not the middle. And the edge is where the excitement is. So let's find the edge as fast as possible and get to work. That's sort of my approach to it, really. And I'm only bored when I'm in the middle, because I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And so there is a contradiction, a massive contradiction there. I think it's a very important thing to recognize as early as you can. It took me a long time to find that out. So I think this is sort of probably the most powerful lesson that I've ever learned, is that, just to face up to it, just to understand it as a method.
Yeah. Rather than an obstacle.
Yeah, it shouldn't be an obstacle at all, because it's actually in your favor, not the opposite.
I looked at your work done for Iggy Pop recently, 2019.
Yeah.
And I think what was evident there is that, and this goes back to the question of output. What was visible there, and what I found, again, quite interesting and potentially emblematic of the current, very contemporary moment, is that the product of your work isn't just one thing.
There's quite a lot to unpack there with that Iggy Pop project, because, I've made 9 pieces with him now, in quite a short period of time, actually, in a period of 2.5 years. And the first 4 came about through my work with Underworld, because they did a collaboration with him, and it was called Tea Time Dub Encounters, and it was Iggy working with techno music, which he said he'd never do, famously techno rubbish. And there he is. So basically, through that process, I went with the band to meet him in Miami, and took a photographer with us who's a good friend. So we were very close the way we worked, and we got about an hour with him to photograph some shots. And during that hour, I had the opportunity to shoot some video. And then it was a portrait of him on video. So it wasn't really, he didn't have to do anything. He just kind of was having his picture taken. I was shooting it. And then I had to sort of turn that into a piece. And I used a lot of typography and sort of very organic analog process to make things around this portrait. And then the other three films, he didn't appear in them, but it was his voice, and he had to okay everything. And I did some sort of quite playful, sort of techie processes, and it was one set of stuff. It ended up to a body of work for that album. His manager got in touch and said, "Simon, do you want to do some more work?" And I kind of jumped at the chance because I really like him and I like what he does, and he's a brilliant person. So what happened was they sort of said, we need 2 videos. And I said, can we do 4 or 5? Why not?
Entrepreneur.
Well, I wasn't looking for more budget. I was just sort of thinking that if we did more, we'd have more fun and we'd get more out of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And also I'd get to spend more time with him, and it would be a better thing all round because we'd find something. Anyway, they sort of, clearly they wanted 2, but they entertained the idea. The problem was I had to shoot everything in one day. Mm-hmm. So what we did was we did all the lighting setup, everything in the studio, exactly down to the light bulbs that we were using in the lighting heads. And all the techniques, we use mirrors and all sorts of things to do it with, and things like nylon cord over lenses to create flares that you can't see, and all sorts of stuff. And then we took this stuff out to Miami, and everything was ready. And we were like an action scene. There were only 4 of us, and we just kind of set it up, shot it. And he famously will only do a certain amount of takes, and then he stops. That's it, So he said to me, well, we'll do 3. I said, well, can we do 3 and then another 3 on a different lens? Yeah, okay. So we did these 3, and he went away, and then he came back, and it was a really lovely, fun experience. But it was terrifying because it was so restrictive. Mm. The results of it are interesting because, it went well. It's quite sort of, the James Bond one is jokey, it's very polished. And I was really restricted with what I could do. He was there in front of me, and that was it. Mm-hmm. We weren't going to be exploring different locations and different setups. That's what I had to do. So in some senses, I'm really pleased with it. In others, I don't know what people think when they see it. It's had a lot of views. I think it's had 1.5 million views or something, which doesn't mean anything. It just means a lot of people have looked at it. But I don't know what they get. I know what I had to make. I know I had to deliver something. I know he looks good.
Yeah, he looks great.
Yeah. But it was sort of really challenging on a lot of levels that you wouldn't imagine. A lot of parameters that we just talked about were really, really tight.
So I guess at the end of that shooting, you have this material.
Yes.
Or did you kind of choreograph what you needed prior to the shooting?
Really tightly. The drawings I made, the drawing plan.
Or the storyboards.
Yeah, I drew it as it's almost like an Edward Tufte piece of information graphics. Mm-hmm. I drew where different instruments came in and drew different shaded areas so that I could look at it and see all the hatch lines are him at this point. So I need that much material of that because I knew he'd only sit and do it a few times.
Yeah. So that's quite a different methodology to the one with the AA students in your studio with masks.
The polar opposite. But I must be honest, I enjoy both.
Yeah.
Just to interject, with the one with the AA students with the mask, I was shooting it, taking the card out of the camera and editing it while they were waiting for me to do the next bit to see if it would work or not.
Yeah.
you know, and let's try it. So it was completely different. And what was funny was that once we'd shot the James Bond thing, we then went to shoot the track that's called Love's Missing, and it's much more gothic and it's completely different feeling and atmosphere, but it's the same place. I mean, we just relit it, and he's got a different energy, and then we finished that, and then we shot this portrait where he does the "We Are the People," the Lou Reed poem, straight to camera. And we only did that in, I think we did one take, and he was so good. And for that one, you know, pre-planned, I bought what's called a lens baby, and it allows you to tilt and shift. And I shot the whole thing just moving this around while we did incredible performance. Wow. I think he did it twice actually, because we got a wide and a close. But
so what else? So there was a series of videos, but what else came out of it in terms of output?
Well, then, you know, there were specifically for that project, the sleeve. So they asked me to look at that. He had some very strong ideas about what the imagery would be for that. It became quite a sort of practical outcome. I'm really happy with how the sleeve looked. And I got a bit of a chance to play with some elements around it. For me, that was about, I have enormous respect for him and what he does and what he's done and his legacy. And I really wanted him and his audience to enjoy that sleeve, to be happy with it. You know, it was a pleasure to do, but I wanted it to be right for him, not for me. Really.
Yeah. So you felt a sense of constraint by the kind of sheer size of a collaborator.
I felt a sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
Some months went by, that was released, it did well. We went to see him at the Barbican Play, it was great. You know, he enjoyed the tour, it was really good. I wasn't on the tour at all, I just went to the London show, but didn't have any more contact. And then out of the blue, I got a call to say, we've never had an official video for The Passenger. And out of everything that I'd ever done for this artist, that was the one I wanted to do. And I couldn't believe it. It was the chance. The Passenger, it's one of the standout tracks of that period of the 80s. Yeah. And they want me to make a video for it. And here we are. Wow. I was in bed with coronavirus at the time. You know, I was feeling like really sick. And I was like, yeah, I'll do that. And I sort of had a lot of conversation with Henry, the manager, about what we should do. And I'm really pleased with that one. That's the one for me that I was very free to interpret. And so
is that happening, or?
It's done, it's online.
Right.
It was released not that long ago, a few months back. But it's, if you Google it, type in YouTube, Biggie Pop Passenger, and it's I suppose it's the most Tomato-esque album.
Right, okay.
If you look back to the sort of classic period of the Tomato works, but interestingly, there's some hidden CGI in there, and I used a lot of techniques that I've developed in the last few years to do with how I shoot using multiple lenses to make stills come alive.
So this project was done. So this project was done over the summer, or?
Yeah, it was done during April, May, I think. And basically, it's still photographs with some archive that I'd shot on the motorway all around London just before the lockdown from a car. And it was about sort of trying to bring these historical still photographs and a sense of the night together. Life, I was trying to get the photos to come alive, basically. Using these lenses that I use, and also using typography, and yeah, take a look.
A lot of the projects you talk about do happen in a kind of external, foreign environment. You know, you spoke about Japan, and in fact, somehow there is some kind of presence of Japanese, I don't know,
I mean, I've been there up until sort of the end of this year. I was there every 2 months, literally every 2 months.
So what's that? Where does that strong connection come from?
Well, I went when I was 18, and I kind of fell in love with the place. And I sold all my possessions so I could get an air ticket. And I went over there and sort of really enjoyed it, and immediately sort of landed in this creative area, and it came back.
Is it Tokyo?
Yeah, actually it was, and then it was in the south. I was in Kyushu quite a bit, and I met a lot of musicians and artists and all sorts of people. And what happened was I came back, went to art school, and then when I left art school, I went straight back again, and immediately sort of started working, doing bits and pieces. But effectively, I was very young, and I was just sort of trying to find my way, really. But I saw Japan as a place of enormous opportunities, because it really wanted what was outside of its boundaries, and it wanted to bring that in. And when you turned up there back in it was sort of 85, you were treated very differently. I mean, it was like a bit of a wonderland, to be honest.
Yeah.
And people took you very seriously, what you were doing. They really wanted to know. So you could sort of find yourself doing things that you wouldn't have the opportunity to do in America or in the UK that easily. And that's when I started meeting people like, TV people, which is how I got that.
Yeah.
How I sold the film. So basically, I ended up with two different occasions. I had a fashion brand, and because of film and doing costume and what have you, I always had quite a strong attitude about what clothing looked like, and I found myself designing clothing.
Wow. So
I'd done 20 menswear collections. I mean, I kind of learned that from the inside out, really, and sort of got to the point where I was quite good at it. I could kind of do that. And what that led to was me having a business there and kind of going backwards and forwards as their creative director. So, yeah, that's why I was in Japan so much.
I mean, what is it about Japan that fascinated you? Was it the kind of intensity or the foreign, the kind of alienation almost that sometimes feel?
Both of those things. So the fact that you were alienated but invited at the same time was really confusing and fascinating. A sense of being...
That is so true. That is a very good definition of it.
Yeah, it really...
I guess the language is the alienating aspect, but yes, you feel this really welcoming culture.
Initially, it's the language, but then I don't speak French either, and that's not felt the same.
Yeah,
there was this sort of incredibly warm, protective blanket that was put around you. At the same, this is very difficult to understand, but at the same time, you were naked in Siberia. It was like that. It was kind of the same thing at the same time, both things at the same time, because there was no way you were ever going to penetrate the wall that was there. But it was all welcoming, and that was crazy. And then I sort of started realizing that I had something that they were interested in as a group, and literally it was skin deep, surface orientated initially, but I realized it went much, much deeper than that, and it went back generations. And I started getting really into kind of how the society worked and what it was about and how they behaved and how I should behave. And it was an ongoing sort of, not project exactly, but fascination that I kept dipping back into. And I at one point, there were a lot of Japanese people here at a certain period in the 90s and 2000s. And a lot of them were musicians. There were a lot of guys. It wasn't just girls. And in the 80s, it was a lot of girls came, and then guys started coming, and then there was a mix. A lot of people were getting married here and staying. And I had such a great bunch of Anglo-Japanese friends that I was sort of encapsulated in this parallel world, in fact. And I think around the 2000 teens, it started to kind of dissipate a bit. People were going back, they were getting a bit older, returning. And
I guess Japan is changing as well.
Japan changed enormously.
Yeah.
And over that period. And so, you know, the spell was broken, the bubble burst, and it became a very different environment. Having said that, during that latter period is when I did most of my traveling there. And, you know, even now I work very, very closely, almost full time with the Japanese outfit over there in communication rather than fashion. But yeah, it's the other effect of it is that I've obviously been absorbing that influence, and that's come out in the work as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I grew up around a lot of Oriental antiques. My dad was very into collecting that stuff, and so even from my youngest possible age, I remember seeing that aesthetic.
Imagery and aesthetic. Yeah. 2010s, and this I'm just now thinking as you're having a kind of, as you're talking about it, I guess were in a way marked by the availability of things. You know, I remember traveling to Japan for £250.
Yeah, I know. That's not going to happen. Well, hopefully not.
If travel is less available, perhaps we will appreciate it more.
We got to a point where we weren't appreciating anything.
Yeah.
The coronavirus came along and taught us that there are things we should appreciate. Each other was one of them. Our own sort of sense of ourselves and freedom that we got used to was another. And then there were these secondary things like the price of things, you know, as you say, air travel and what have you. I think it's changed. I hope it's given us pause for thought. I'm not, you know, we're human, we forget. We'll go back to whatever is the most conservative form of existence that we can manage, because we always do as humans. But yeah, it fundamentally will change the way we think about things. And then don't forget that's happening. That whole energy is kind of circulating at the same time as the ongoing digitization of our lives is happening, and everything that entails. So I think fascinating what might happen next. I don't have any wild predictions about it. I really like oh damn, I've forgotten his name, it's slipped my mind. It'll come back to me in a minute. Anyway, I really like this idea that we're moving from a market situation to a networked situation. Yeah. And I see lots of sort of pitfalls and opportunities in that. Because something that we know about a market is very black and white and easy to grasp. And what we don't know about networks is how the dispersed nature of them can be understood in a tangible way. And that we're trying to get to grips with that. You know, it's getting a bit technical, but when you start looking at things like cryptocurrencies and you start looking at even systems like eBay, where there isn't a centralized holder of stuff anymore, it's kind of completely dispersed. This is really interesting.
Yeah, it's a network. Yeah,
network orientated sort of composition to society. That's interesting. That's where it's going. Yeah, how we respond to it is going to be the next big moves. And you know, Jeremy Rifkin talks a lot about this. For me, he's the go-to person that talks about this. He really sort of has a very clear understanding of from his mind of what historically has happened and what will happen. He's got a lot of hope and sort of optimism about the future through how he sees humanity operating. So he's a very good sort of guide. He's non-conspiratorial, which I like about him.
You know how London used to be just a conglomerate villages, and how obviously the development of the underground
Yeah.
globalized London in a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And obviously that's now happened on a global scale,
Yeah.
you know, globalization, etc. And I guess I can, and speaking about Japan, I can immediately think about that architectural little Bible in Prize of Shadows,
Yeah.
which does talk about shadows and the importance of darkness in Japanese architecture. But I think the even more important message is the message of, is this kind of question, what would Japan be like if the Westerner never came?
But, you know, if you look at global human history, you see, not necessarily in parallel, in unison, but what you see is a kind of generalized development of our cognition, our cognitive ability, and what that creates. And I think, you know, Perry opening up Japan in 1850 or whenever it was, during the Meiji period, sort of put a halt on feudalism, and it changed. And if he hadn't turned up, would they still be feudal? Probably not, because their cognition would have operated the level and they would have changed. I mean, what this really opens up, to me, is a question of diversity. And I think what's really paramount importance is that in the march towards globalization and this sort of opening up and access that we enjoy so much, that we stop celebrating diversity. That's a really big problem. On every single level that you can imagine, or one can imagine, from nature through to thought, which are the same thing, but, you know, the dispersed nature of that. Because diversity is where we get the chance to find new things and discuss differences.
Yeah, it's interesting, but then within every diversity there is a certain contradiction in what you just said, because obviously at the base of every diversity is a certain unity or some kind of universality. Noam Chomsky, the linguist, has this theory of universal grammar, and I loved how he explains it by saying that you know, there is a certain universal language that operates across all human languages. And he gives an example of a Martian coming to planet Earth and hearing all languages. All the languages will actually appear as a single language to a external entity.
They would probably see it as a vocabulary. Rather than because linguistically they're all connected. They work, they operate. I mean, I was reading about the Praha tribe in the Amazon who have fewer consonants and no past or future tense. And that struck me as kind of an alien concept. You know, they don't have any creation myth, so they can't actually make any history apart from oral history, which is passed the last two generations. And when you ask them about something, they say, well, it's always been like that. I mean, that's only stops there, nothing else happens. Now that strikes me as quite a different type of structure. But I think Chomsky's right when he says that the universality between all of our communication is uniform. And really you just get into a sense of vocabulary. That's fascinating.
So there is that real duality between universality and diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we get back to the subject of identity. And I think, you know, when we awaken this idea that it's okay to be different and we can still be universally similar and enjoy a point of view or a difference in opinion, but ultimately we're bedded in the same thing. When we really embrace that,